Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
Support comes from Mercedes-Benz of Buckhead, where the power of electric meets the power of Mercedes. Introducing a lineup of electric vehicles, the EQB, the EQS sedan and SUV, the EQE sedan and SUV. The vehicles are all electric. The feeling is all Mercedes. Mercedesofbuckhead.com.
Every member of this Senate body should be deeply troubled by the actions of the Fulton County District Attorney and the stain it has put on Fulton County and the state of Georgia.
Republicans under the Gold Dome pounce on misconduct allegations lodged against Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, the lead prosecutor in the Georgia election interference case.
And lawmakers advance measures on elections and anti-Semitism.
When I say this bill is meaningful, I mean that it is meaningful to the Jewish community in this state, which has been subjected to ever-increasing anti-Semitic harassment.
Plus, we'll talk to WABE housing reporter Stephanie Stokes about her new investigation into housing and foster care.
I'm WABE politics reporter Raul Bally.
And I'm politics reporter Sam Greenglass. It's week 3 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Dome Scramble, a pop-up podcast about the legislature and more from Political Breakfast and WABE News in Atlanta.
Hey, Raul. So before we kick off today's show, I have a little trivia question for you.
Ooh, I love trivia.
I was under a different Capitol dome recently, the one at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. And I want to ask you if you know the 2 Georgians who are currently represented in Statuary Hall.
I do, because this was something that was actually debated around here a couple of years ago. It's Alexander Stephens and Crawford Long.
Okay, and remind us who they are. Alexander Stephens, I imagine, is the one that some lawmakers want to replace. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. But the one that I feel like a lot of people don't know is Crawford Long. Do you know why we care about him?
So Crawford Long was a doctor here in Georgia, and he actually was one of the first to discover the effects of ether that was used as an anesthesia in surgery. And actually, people who've lived here in Georgia a while may have remembered the name Crawford Long, because that was actually the name of a hospital in Midtown Atlanta. So we had Crawford Long Hospital, I want to say until like the mid-2000s before it went under another name.
You're fun facting my fun fact. I love it. Okay, Raul, this week we are still waiting on District Attorney Fani Willis to directly respond to allegations of an improper relationship with the special prosecutor and demands from one of the co-defendants that she be disqualified from the Georgia election interference case. On Thursday, former President Trump joined that motion. And Raul, it seems like in the absence of a formal response, Republicans have been filling the vacuum by casting doubts on the integrity of the case.
So we've seen Republicans, including state lawmakers, make a number of moves. One of the most notable is a proposed state Senate committee to investigate District Attorney Willis. Republican State Senator Greg Dolezal is the lead author of the resolution creating that committee.
The state funds about $30 million to the Prosecuting Attorney's Council. About $3 million of that goes to Fulton County. And so what a lot of my constituents have been asking is, how has that money been spent? Is there anything that needs to happen with state law? Was there a conflict of interest here? There's a lot of questions, Mr. Chairman, that are out there in the public, and we are merely going to empower this committee to have those questions answered.
Now, let me cover a couple of more points. The proposed committee would have 6 Republican and 3 Democratic state senators. It would have subpoena power and the ability to place people under oath. Here's the bottom line. While the direct goal of the committee is to eventually produce possible legislation and other recommendations, this committee could also bring to light either wrongdoing, alleged wrongdoing committed by the district attorney or anyone else. and some of that may be of a personal nature. As we tape this podcast, the expectation is that the state Senate will be voting on Senate Resolution 465 over the next few days, leading to the immediate creation of the committee. And then the next step will be the appointment of those 9 members. So, Sam, let's take our audience 1 block from here at the state capitol down to the Fulton County Courthouse. And are we getting a better sense of the legal implications for the Georgia election interference case? Because, when people ask me why we're covering this, that's my general answer.
That's right. And I should say, Raul, I did a story on this earlier in the week, and I got a lot of those same responses asking, why are you even covering this? These allegations are salacious, comments of that nature. But the reality is that these allegations could delay the case, if not derail it. And just a brief reminder of what we're talking about here, co-defendant Michael Roman is accusing Willis of a conflict of interest, saying that Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade was hired despite not being qualified for the job, and alleging that Willis has some kind of personal interest because Wade's pay would indirectly benefit her. Again, these allegations have been unsubstantiated. Now, this week, former President Obama's ethics czar, Norm Eisen, said he still believes there are no legal grounds to disqualify or dismiss Willis or Wade, but he also said this.
Mr. Wade, in the public interest, you should voluntarily make the decision to step aside so we can get the case back on track and the focus where it should be on the alleged criminality by Mr. Trump and his co-conspirators, including Mr. Roman.
And Raul, continued fallout from this issue could affect not only the chances of the trial getting started this year, appeals could drag on for a long time, but also whether a jury ultimately trusts the integrity of the investigation.
And Sam, let me bring in one other voice in this discussion, Georgia State law professor Clark Cunningham. He's one of the go-to professors for reporters here in Atlanta on a number of legal issues. And he wrote a guest piece this week in the New York Times. And I just want to share this quick quote with you. Quote, "I believe the judicious and far-sighted course would be for Miss Willis to take a personal leave of absence and turn over control of the district attorney's office and the case against Mr. Trump to a career deputy district attorney. Doing so would be an act of public service by Willis and, more important, offer the best option for keeping the criminal case on track," unquote.
Yeah, and I think that quote is notable, Raul, because I talked to Professor Cunningham when these allegations first came out a couple of weeks ago, and he did not go that far at that point. And Raul, I think it is important not to cover the story breathlessly, but to be very clear-eyed about the stakes. And I think the most important date coming up is this February 15th hearing when Judge Scott McAfee considers the issue in his courtroom.
So, Sam, let's get back out of the courtroom and back to where I'm sitting here in the House chamber of the legislature.
Yeah, we have talked about unfinished business from the last session that is still on the docket for lawmakers this year. And a big one is this push to codify a definition of anti-Semitism as it relates to Georgia's hate crimes law. The latest iteration of that bill has now passed the Senate and the House. Raul, talk to me about the debate and where this goes next.
So let's start with the basics of the legislation we're talking about. House Bill 30. It would put into state law the definition of anti-Semitism. It would be used in the context of hate crimes legislation and discrimination cases. There have been a couple of points of controversy. They include whether this affects free speech rights, specifically the ability to criticize the government of Israel. Second, there's been a debate on what definition to use. One person who spoke out earlier this week against House Bill 30 during a Senate hearing was Luma Yunus, a student at Georgia Tech.
The prospect that the very words I speak today might be turned into a tool for litigation against myself or my family members is antithetical to the values of free speech and justice. This scenario presents a disregard for my constitutionally protected rights, but also inaccurately conflates my criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
Now, supporters say there are First Amendment protections in the legislation. Look, this is going to come down to how prosecutors and state agencies implement this definition in the law.
Raul, can you talk about what changed since last year when this bill stalled in the Senate?
Clearly, one factor is the Hamas attack on October the 7th. It refocused people's attention on this. Here's State Representative Esther Panich, who's been one of the most vocal backers of this legislation.
I think the whole world saw what happened on October 7th and the fallout to the Jewish community, to Jewish communities around the world. And if it was only about Israel and people's disagreements with Israel, then anti-Semitism wouldn't have climbed 360% in those 3 months.
Now, as you mentioned, it did pass the House and the Senate, is heading to the governor's desk, and I think we're going to be expecting a signing ceremony pretty soon. Now, Sam, let's switch to some new legislation as we saw a flurry of election bills hit committees. It felt like Tuesday was voting day and elections day at the Capitol. And Sam, I wanted you to focus on one of those bills, specifically this effort to remove Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger from the state election board. What's going on there?
Okay, just a little bit of background first. The state election board enforces Georgia election law. Republicans currently appoint 4 of the 5 seats on the board. Now, Republican lawmakers stripped the Secretary of State's board vote back in 2021. They demoted him from chair of the election board to ex officio, basically a non-voting member. And now they want him off the board entirely. This comes after, in December, the election board deadlocked over opening an investigation into Raffensperger's handling of the 2020 election. And then they asked the legislature to basically clarify if they even had the power to investigate him at all. This bill gives the board that power and the power to initiate other election probes of their own. The Secretary of State opposes this bill and is arguing that it violates the Georgia Constitution and the separation of powers.
Sam, like with so many election and voting stories, there's so much more context. Can you share that broader context with us?
Yeah, many Republicans have slammed Raffensperger for not cracking down on purported fraud in 2020. And Republicans like Senator Randy Robertson say constituents' confidence in elections has cratered and the state's response has been, quote, weak at best.
Each and every day, we are all flooded, whether it be text messages, emails, or letters of citizens still concerned about the integrity of our elections.
Now, that's despite multiple audits and recounts and what seems like annual rewrites to election law. Raul, this year, Republicans are moving bills to eliminate QR codes on ballots, upload scans of every ballot online for public viewing, adding special seals to ballots, and the list goes on and on and on. And I think, Raul, nothing is really going to convince people as long as there are people in power in the party who are still raising doubts about the 2020 election.
And Sam, before we go, I want to point you to a topic that I'm going to be watching for in the next week or two, and that's online sports betting. So there's brand new legislation that was just filed that would allow sports betting under the Georgia lottery. This is a bill we've heard before. Here are the important things I wanted to share with the audience. This would be considered a new game under the Georgia lottery, and the revenues and taxes would go where they've been going before, the Hope Scholarship and pre-K. But here's what's really important. Senate Bill 386 has the backing of the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the Democratic Senate minority leader. So you have very powerful people, which means the votes may be there to get it done. Something we're going to be following.
And Raul, real quick, Republicans need Democratic votes on this because the Republican Party is not unified. Makes me wonder, what do Democrats get in return?
Something we're going to be following.
Let's take a break here. This is Dome Scramble from WABE.
Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at wabe.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
WABE.
From WABE Studios, the podcast where they read stories is a new children's storytelling podcast featuring notable Atlantans and performers reading classic and contemporary children's books. Each episode contains a story meant to entertain, inspire, and inform young listeners. No screens required. The podcast where they read stories features adaptations from both chapter books and picture books. Join us at wabe.org/stories podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
WABE.
Welcome back to Dome Scramble. Joining us now is Stephanie Stokes. She's an investigative reporter covering housing for WABE, and she's got a new story out this week in partnership with ProPublica titled, "When Families Need Housing, Georgia Will Pay for Foster Care Rather Than Provide Assistance." Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Hey, y'all.
So, Stephanie, before we get to your latest investigation, I want to just ask you a little bit about your beat. Not every outlet has a reporter dedicated to covering housing like we are lucky to have. And, on the one hand, housing is so basic, so fundamental, but covering housing, I imagine, can also get really wonky. It wraps in development policy, tax policy, social services. So I'm curious, why you think people should really be paying attention to this beat in particular.
Just like you said, it's such a basic thing in our life. It affects everything else, from where we go to school, what jobs we have access to, our health, mental health, and, our ability just to improve our lives. If I always think about if someone has, a roach infestation or sewage backing up in their sink, it's hard to really think about anything else, and, including who you might vote for. So it just can really determine so much else. And that's why it has always interested me. And I've always been interested in the ways that housing intersects with other beats as well. So in this case, the child welfare system.
So Stephanie, you report that Georgia is often spending way more money to house kids in foster care who otherwise could be with their families if they had access to stable housing. How often is this happening?
So this story all started because I learned about this federal foster care data. So when states remove children, they have to tell the federal government when they're doing that, and they have to list the reasons why the children are coming into foster care. And it's like a multiple choice question. And one of the things that states can pick is housing, inadequate housing. And I will say, just to be clear, that states can pick multiple reasons. So they could click housing and neglect, which is a broad category that can actually include lack of housing. And they can click inadequate housing and substance abuse. That's common. When I learned about this data, I also learned that Georgia was citing inadequate housing in 20% of cases of children entering foster care. And this amounts to more than 6,000 cases of a child being removed. And that was just shocking to me. That's, a fifth of children have inadequate housing as a component of their case. And with ProPublica, we were also able to look at when housing was being cited by itself, because like I said, states can pick multiple reasons. So we were also able to see when caseworkers were removing a child into foster care and only picking inadequate housing as the reason. Now, so experts say this should just never happen, because housing is typically based on someone's financial circumstances, and poverty is not supposed to be a reason for bringing children into foster care. But we found, looking at a 5-year period, that it does happen. And Georgia, in fact, had 700 cases like this. So 700 cases of a child being removed just for inadequate housing.
So 700 cases. When we look at the cost for providing foster care for those 700 kids, how does that compare to, say, if you were to just provide rental assistance to keep these kids in their homes in the first place?
Yeah, it definitely depends on the case, the family situation and how many children, but definitely advocates and attorneys for parents, that's something they flagged to me immediately, was that they really believed that the cost of foster care would ultimately be more than just the cost of helping the family get housing. And so, we can do some quick math. So just 3 children in foster care, the cost of housing them for just a month in foster care is about $2,700. And that's the absolute minimum. And there's so many costs on top of that that are not captured there, like transportation. And then if the children have any special needs, there's additional payments on top of that. And so $2,700 a month, you can quickly see how, that ends up being more than a few months of back rent. I think housing costs are rising in Atlanta, but even a lot of, I would say many landlords are still offering entire homes for less than $2,700.
So let's go beyond the numbers. Your story focuses on a single mom named Brittany Wise. Can you tell us about her?
Yeah, I met Brittany Wise last April, unfortunately, right when her children entered foster care. And she had been experiencing a crisis that had been building for some time. She had been trying to make a new life in Georgia after leaving an abusive relationship in North Carolina, and she brought her 8 kids here. But she really struggled to find affordable housing for a family of her size, and her children were struggling with their behavior that was causing them to get suspended from school, and she was having a lot of trouble holding any kind of job for that reason. And when things were really getting bad, she reached out to the Division of Family and Children's Services, DFACS, Georgia's Child Welfare Agency, and she asked for help, particularly with her housing situation. And her caseworker essentially told her, I don't have much I can offer you because we don't have resources here. We don't have funding to house families at DFACS. And she even said at one point that that's not really DFACS's job, that DFACS's job is to the safety of children and to house children. So Wise, she ended up moving into a hotel room with her kids and was trying to figure things out on her own since she really couldn't get any help. And then this all culminated in this day where she was stopped by a police officer for an expired tag on her vehicle. And then the police officer found that she had this unaddressed traffic citation. And so this led to her actually going to jail for a few days, which, in itself, I think is surprising to some people. But her children had to go into foster care during those 3 days because of this being jailed. And that could have been a situation where she could get her kids afterward, but because she didn't have stable housing and income, the state has refused to return her children so far. And now it's been months.
So over these months, Wise has tried to get help from nonprofits, from government caseworkers, but it just seems like it has been impossible to climb out, and this one setback just keeps spiraling.
Yeah, it's been really hard to watch because I have known her now, for 9 months, and all of these failed attempts have really affected her mental health, and especially as the separation from her children has gone on. And as she's told me, it's made it difficult to hold a job or do all these things that she'd like to do to improve herself. This is how she puts it.
Who can really function and focus in a situation where everything around you is on fire?
And unfortunately, advocates have told me that, this is really common among parents with children in foster care. Some are able to, just put their head down and get to work and stabilize their lives. And maybe it could even be a little easier without having to worry about feeding their children, making sure their children are housed. But the advocates I've talked to said the opposite is also very common, if not more common, that parents are so affected and traumatized by the separation from their children that they have an even harder time finding stability than before. And this can actually, really spiral and can lead to parents just losing their rights to their children, the state terminating their rights.
Stephanie, what has DFACS told you about why the state's first resort is foster care versus helping with housing?
So the state will say that it does everything it can to preserve families and reunify families when they have been separated. And the state has actually argued in its statements to me that housing is not really a big factor for children entering foster care, that usually there's underlying issues like a mental health condition or substance addiction. Like I said, some advocates will say that any case where housing is bringing children into foster care is too many. But also the advocates I've spoken to say that the state's statement really underestimates the role that housing plays in parents' lives and their crises that they're dealing with. So how housing instability can, just worsen mental health conditions and then also even drive, like a drug addiction. So the question is, like, if they had housing, would they really be struggling with these things? And then it also, what the state says contradicts what I've heard from caseworkers on the ground who say that they are spending so much of their time, especially in the metro area, just dealing with families who need housing. And these caseworkers are, just scrambling to find resources for these families so that their kids don't get taken into foster care. And one caseworker said to me that she felt that, all this time actually it distracts caseworkers from real cases of abusive parents because they're spending so much time just trying to find some financial resources for families.
How does Georgia's approach to this challenge compare to the policy choices being made by other states?
Sure, there's some interesting things. So some states have laws that specifically say homelessness is not a reason to remove children from their families. Georgia doesn't have a law like that, nor does it even really have any clear policy that I could find about how child welfare workers should interact with families who don't have housing. Other states have gone even further and dedicated significant funding to helping families in these situations. So we found that several states have child welfare agencies that have invested tens of millions of dollars into housing assistance for families in the child welfare system. So they really see housing as their job. And in Connecticut, in fact, which has a third of the population of Georgia, has invested close to $20 million a year just to help house families so that their children aren't stuck in foster care.
So, Stephanie, let's bring it back to where I'm sitting. I'm sitting in the state capitol, actually sitting in the House chamber. What could lawmakers or the state agencies across the street do to fix this problem? Is it a question of funding, legislation, regulations? Is it the tangle of state agencies and the courts? What can be done?
I think it's all of those things. Like I said, funding is one answer. Clear policies, clear guidance can help. And then coordination definitely between state agencies and local agencies, because we also found that there's federal money specifically to help families in the child welfare system get housing. There's housing vouchers, and some states have been really aggressive in requesting these vouchers. And we found that some cities in Georgia have, like Atlanta, but for most of the state, families in this situation are sort of out of luck because they don't have access to these vouchers. And that's simply because the state hasn't applied for them. From what we heard, the Department of Community Affairs had said that they didn't have the staff capacity to apply for these. And DFEC said it was interested in applying for them at a state level. But this program has been around since the 1990s. So it's a real question for why that hasn't happened yet.
So to bring it back to Brittany Wise, this woman that you have followed for many months now, I understand from your reporting that her kids have now been separated from her at this point in foster care for something like 9 months. What happens to this family now?
I really can't say. It's really up to the court system. There's a lot of people involved in cases once they get into the court. There's the children's attorneys, there's what's called the guardian ad litem, who also represent the best interest of the children. There's the attorney for defects and parents' attorneys, and they all have to come to a decision. But I will say that as the longer these cases go on, definitely the more difficult they become. And like we said, parents can struggle really to get stable and get back on track. And also it can be really hard on children, of course. There are cases where children have foster placements where they really struggle. So that can be really hard, and that takes a lot of healing afterward. But also it can be hard if children are in foster placements that they really like, because that can make it hard in some cases to return home. And so every day these cases go on, the bond deteriorates between the parents and the children.
That's WABE Stephanie Stokes. You can read her full investigation at WABE.org. Stephanie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
And you can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast. And check out WABE.org/Under the Gold Dome. We'll be back next week.
Hey, it's Alex Sujong Laughlin and Kelsey McKinney
from the Normal Gossip podcast.
We're so excited to announce that we're bringing our show live to a stage near you.
Normal Gossip is coming to Atlanta on March 8th at Symphony Hall, and we can't wait to see you there.
Join us for glow sticks, a real squirrel hat, secrets, and a great gossip story we can't stop telling.
Tickets are on sale now at normalgossiplive.com.